Lecture 2, From Israelite to Jew.
Hi, my name is Shai Cherry, and we're continuing with our Introduction to Judaism here at the Teaching Company. This lecture is entitled From Israelite to Jew. What we hope to do in this lecture is to outline the history of the Israelite people according to the Tanakh, according to the Hebrew Bible. I want to emphasize that the history that we're going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes is the history or the historiography, the story of the Israelites' existence and dedication to God and problems with keeping dedicated to God and their experiences in the land of Israel from their own perspective. For many of these historical events, we don't have external corroboration. So what I'm not doing here is presenting Jewish history. I'm presenting the history of the Israelite people from their own perspective. And we start at the beginning, as we talked about in Lecture 1, with the creation of the world. That was the point of the creation of human beings. The rabbis recognized early on that those first 6 days of creation really couldn't be technical days of creation, because for the first 3 days the sun wasn't around. Right? The sun wasn't created until day 4, and we generally mark the passage of a day by the sun. Whether the sun goes around us or we go around the sun is involved. So the rabbis started counting time not from day 1, but from the existence of human beings, day 6. Therefore, there's no problem in Judaism with accepting an age of the earth as 4.5 billion years old, which is what the scientists tell us. And also, incidentally, there's also no problem accepting the transmutation of species, which is widely accepted within the Jewish community. From the creation, we go to Cain and Abel and what we call primeval myth or primeval history, the Tower of Babel, stories that try to get at this very complicated relationship between God and early human beings that seem to keep going downhill. With Cain and Abel, we have Cain killing his brother Abel. Then we've got God wiping out all of humanity in the flood of Noah. And what does God say? This very sad line from Genesis 6:5, that the devisings of a human being's heart are only evil from his youth. This psychological propensity to commit evil. Notice it's a psychological propensity to commit evil and not a kind of ontological, which is that big Greek word that means in your essence, a necessity to be evil. But certainly the characters in the early chapters in Genesis did not act very righteously. History then continues with Noah and his family, and again, things go downhill with the building of the Tower of Babel. Finally, God decides to select one person, and from that one person to establish a covenant and to see if by having a specific covenant with a specific person, he can build a righteous society. And this, of course, is Avram. His name doesn't become Abraham until a few chapters later. God tells Abram, or Avram, to leave Aram, where he was from, and to head out toward the land of Israel because he doesn't want to be encumbered with the baggage of his parents and his high school buddies and his community. He really needs to start thinking out of the box and start worshiping God, one God, as opposed to a multiplicity of gods, in a new way that will best be done on a solo journey. Not quite solo. He takes his wife and he takes his nephew Lot, right, and they head as well as his father, actually, Terach, and they head west toward the land of Israel, which at that point is called the land of Canaan. Maybe that happened about 2000 BCE, something like that. What is these initials BCE? Before the Common Era, as opposed to before Christ, and then after. The next side of the divide is not AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, because Jews don't recognize Jesus as being the Lord, so they say the Common Era. So on the one hand, they're using more, academics and Jews both tend to use this terminology of BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era, as a way to be more neutral. On the other hand, they're still using the birth of Jesus as that which demarcates what came before and what came after. So the years that I'm going to be talking about are still the same years if you just need to convert in your head from BCE to BC or from CE to AD. So again, Abraham, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that probably happened around 2000 BCE, if it happened. Again, scholars don't have any evidence outside of the Hebrew Bible that there were such people as the patriarchs. This is Jewish history from within the biblical corpus. Then we've got the book of Exodus. It begins with, the Israelites becoming very fruitful and multiplying greatly, and there seems to be a change of regime, a new Pharaoh who doesn't recognize or who doesn't like, perhaps, Joseph and his clan. And so we have this trick, really, to kill. It's not a trick, it's a contract to kill the male babies and keep the female babies alive, because there's a concern that there's going to be some kind of revolt. Eventually the Hebrews, the Israelites, they're called Hebrews at this point, are made slaves. And Moses, around the year 1250 BCE, succeeds in letting my people go, in freeing the Israelite slaves from the house of bondage, taking them through the Sea of Reeds. The Red Sea is actually a mistranslation. It's not red, it's reed. There were reeds in those seas, Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and then eventually, 49 days after the liberation from Egypt, they get to Mount Sinai, and they have a revelatory experience of God giving the Decalogue. Jews say Decalogue, by the way, not the 10 Commandments, because Jews have 613 commandments, and there are actually more than 10 that are included in the Decalogue. For instance, on 6 days you shall work, on the 7th day shall be a Sabbath to you. Well, usually you count one, that you should have a Sabbath on the 7th day. But there's also, on 6 days you shall work. People forget about working for 6 days, especially in this country, but it's one of the commandments. Okay? So we say the Decalogue are the 10 utterances, the 10 words of God. There's a 40-year sojourn in the desert. And then finally, Moses dies and that whole generation dies. The only two people from that generation, from the Exodus, that actually lived to make it into the promised land, the land of Canaan at this point, are Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua ben Nun assumes leadership from Moses, and he leads the Israelites across the Jordan River, and the Jordan River splits, just like Moses split the Sea of Reeds. If we were to make a sequel to the 10 Commandments, they'd probably use the same set at Universal Studios. Brings the Israelites, or at least the vanguard stormtroopers, to Jericho, conquers Jericho, and that begins this period of conquest that probably lasts about 200 years. And finally, what we have in the 11th century BCE is a loose confederation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob, whose name gets changed to Israel, has 12 sons, and not exactly each of those sons, but basically each of those sons, and then there are 2 tribes from Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, but Levi, one of the sons, doesn't get a tribal inheritance, so there are 12 tribes that get land in the land of Israel and also in what today is Jordan, just on the other side of the Jordan River. And they existed in a loose confederacy for about 200 years until they would mobilize and get together for external threats. But otherwise, they would conduct their own business, their own governmental affairs, their own judicial needs as a confederation, sort of the federalist system, rather than having a strong centralized government. Around the year 1020 BCE, the Israelites demanded a king. Let us have a king. And the prophet Samuel anoints Shaul, as the first king of Israel. Right? It doesn't go so well for the first 20 years. Finally, David takes over the kingship from Saul. David is not King Saul's son. David becomes the second king of Israel, and at that point, the monarchy becomes hereditary, so that any legitimate king of Israel has to be able to claim Davidic ancestry, which is why the genealogies in the Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew and Luke, all trace the genealogy of Jesus, who is understood to be the Messiah or the King of Israel, back to David, right? Because that's how you claim authentic entitlement to the crown. David had many, many, many sons, and one particular son, through Bathsheba, which is an interesting story all by itself, Solomon assumes the crown around 961, and his reign is marked by internal rebellion. One of the things about Solomon's reign is that he is successful in building the temple in Jerusalem. And here we have a quote from 1 Kings 8 that describes that moment of the dedication of the first temple. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of the whole community of Israel. He spread the palms of his hands toward heaven and said, O Lord God of Israel, in the heavens above and on the earth below, there is no God like you, who keep your gracious covenant with your servants when they walk before you in wholehearted devotion. Notice that Solomon says there is no God like you. At this point in the Israelite religion, it's not pure monotheism. The Israelites may only have one God, but that's not to say that they don't recognize the existence of other gods for other people. They only have one God. This is either called henotheism, right? Worship of one God, or monolatry, worship of one God, right? Two words to get at the same idea. So at this point, the Israelites only worshiped one God, at least officially. They were only supposed to worship one God. We see some backsliding periodically in the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, but they recognized the existence and reality of other gods for the other surrounding peoples. When King Solomon dies in 922, the kingdom of Israel splits. You've got the 10 northern tribes, that's called Israel, and you've got 2 tribes in the south, that's called Judah. So you've got the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem is in Judah. It's actually in the tribal allotment of Benjamin. The 10 northern tribes were ruled by Jeroboam, and the southern tribes were ruled by Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Now, in 721, you've got the great power at that point of the ancient Near East, Assyria, coming in and destroying the northern kingdom. The Israelites are exiled. The Israelites in the north, in the northern kingdom of Israel, they're exiled at that point, and they're decimated. So 1 out of every 10 was killed. That's what decimated means, right? Decimal. And the other 9 were spread out all over the Assyrian kingdom, which was quite extensive at that point. Those are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It's not that they were lost, they didn't know where they were, but they lost their national identity or their corporate identity because they weren't exiled en masse, so they assimilated and acculturated into the surrounding regions. That happened in 721 BCE. The kingdom of Judah fared a little bit better. And so they actually didn't experience the wrath of the leading power of the day until 150 years or so later. At that point, the way power politics works, the Assyrians were no longer the hegemon in the region, but the Babylonians were. And in 597, the Babylonians conquered Judah, the 2 southern tribes in that southern kingdom, and they exiled its leaders. And then in 586, the final blow came. The temple in Jerusalem that King Solomon had built was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Judean population was exiled to Babylonia en masse. So they maintained their corporate identity. So they were Judeans outside of Judah. This is the first time in Jewish history where people that later become called Jews have to deal with having this kind of identity that's linked to the land that they're no longer living on. Let me read to you one of the Psalms, Psalm 137, that gets at this feeling of being displaced and disoriented. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs. Our tormentors for amusement, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory, even at my happiest hour.